"This floor is not for delivery boys," the man sneered without even looking up from his phone. "You need to use the service entrance. Back alley, down the ramp." Malik Thompson stood in the gleaming marble lobby of Thompson Holdings, his worn boots leaving faint traces of city grit on the polished floor. He hadn't spoken a word yet, hadn't even made it past the front desk. But already, the judgment had landed. No one asked his name. No one asked what he was doing there. They just looked at his hoodie, his skin, and his silence, and decided he didn't belong. The man who spoke was Brian Carter, head of facilities and self-proclaimed gatekeeper of standards. Tall, mid-40s, always dressed like he had somewhere more important to be, Brian liked things clean, efficient, and predictable. Malik, in his eyes, was none of those things. He was trouble. And more importantly, he didn't look like Thompson Holdings material. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't explain himself. He didn't say who he really was. He simply looked at Brian with a calm that could only come from knowing the truth. Then, gently, he asked, "Is there a hiring manager I can speak to?" Brian blinked and finally looked up. "What, for you?" His voice twisted the last word like it tasted bitter. "We don't do walk-ins. You need experience. Referrals. Qualifications." He motioned toward the desk. "But hey, why don't you ask if janitorial's hiring? You might get lucky." Malik nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, as if Brian had done him a favor. Across the lobby, the receptionist, a woman with a sharp bob and sharper smile, pretended to type something, then turned to Brian with a knowing look. "Actually," she said, her voice sugar-coated with sarcasm, "we do have one janitorial spot open. Third shift. Mostly cleaning bathrooms." Brian smirked. "Perfect." The other employees passing by didn't stop, but they glanced, some amused, some indifferent, a few visibly uncomfortable. Malik's posture didn't change. His voice didn't rise. He leaned slightly toward the desk. "I'll take it." A beat of silence. Brian laughed out loud. "You're serious?" Malik nodded. "Very." The receptionist printed out a visitor badge and slid it across the counter. "No welcome. No handshake. Just that look, that familiar look that black men know too well. The kind that says, you'll never be one of us." As Malik walked away, badge in hand, he could hear their laughter behind him. But he didn't turn around. Because this was exactly what he came to see. What none of them knew, not Brian, not the receptionist, not the employees who snickered as they passed, was that Malik wasn't some desperate man looking for scraps. He wasn't a dropout, or an ex-con, or someone who had stumbled into the wrong building. Malik Thompson was the rightful heir to the Thompson fortune. The first son of William Thompson, who built this empire from the ground up. The same William whose name was etched into the lobby wall in gold lettering. And Malik? Malik had been watching from afar for years. He had grown up far from this glass tower. His mother, a black woman from the South Side, raised him to be grounded, humble, and brilliant. She never married William, but William never denied his son. Instead, he gave Malik the freedom to grow on his own terms. Malik studied abroad. Built businesses of his own. But always, he watched. And when whispers reached him, rumors that Thompson Holdings had grown cold, toxic, and subtly racist, he didn't confront his father. He didn't demand answers. He came back in silence. In disguise. Not to prove a point, but to see the truth. By the end of the day, Malik was in uniform, company-issued overalls, a mop bucket in one hand, and a floor schedule in the other. He had been assigned to clean the West Wing, executive suites, boardroom corridors, and employee restrooms. No introductions. No training. Just orders. And then came Sandra. Sandra Miller, janitorial supervisor, was the kind of person who wielded petty power like a sword. She'd been at Thompson Holdings for 20 years and made sure everyone knew it. Tall, sharp-voiced, and ruthless when she wanted to be, Sandra took one look at Malik and immediately decided she didn't like him. "You think just because you've got a calm face and quiet mouth that you're gonna coast here," she snapped as she handed him a rag. "This ain't charity. You mess up, you're gone. You miss a spot, I'll find it." Malik nodded once, taking the rag without a word. That first shift, she followed him down the hall like a shadow. Pointed out imaginary smudges. Snatched the mop from his hands to demonstrate. Made sure every command was barked loud enough for passing employees to hear. And when Malik finished wiping down the main conference room, polished the table until it reflected light like a mirror, Sandra walked in with a cup of black coffee. She stared him down, then, without warning, tossed the entire cup across the table. Hot liquid splattered, ran down the glass, pooled onto the freshly cleaned floor. "You missed a spot," she said flatly. Malik looked at her, then at the mess, then back again. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just picked up the rag and began wiping it again. A junior exec passing by slowed to watch, then quickly moved on. Sandra crossed her arms, triumphant. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she was trying to humiliate wasn't just cleaning their mess. He was watching them. Listening. Learning. Every insult. Every laugh. Every time someone said, "He's just a janitor." Malik was taking notes. Because soon, very soon, the entire company would know exactly who he was. And when they did, the ones who mocked him would realize they hadn't just disrespected a stranger. They had disrespected their next CEO. Their boss. Their future. And all they could see was a hoodie, a mop, and a face they didn't want to understand. It had only been 3 days since Malik Thompson had accepted the janitor position at Thompson Holdings, but already the weight of the building was pressing down on him in more ways than one. Not the physical weight, the structure was steel and concrete, designed to impress and intimidate, but the cultural weight. The unspoken rules. The stares. The hierarchy. And the way people looked at him when they thought no one else was watching. Every morning, he arrived 20 minutes early, changed into his uniform in the service locker room tucked behind the freight elevator, and began his rounds. He swept the halls of the executive wing, wiped down glass tables, emptied trash cans, and cleaned restrooms no one thanked him for. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't draw attention. But somehow, attention found him anyway. It began subtly. The way employees passed him in the hall without meeting his eyes. The way conversations stopped when he walked into a room. It wasn't always overt. It wasn't always loud. But it was always there, quiet condescension, polite indifference, and, in some cases, outright disdain. Sandra Miller made sure of that. Every single shift, she found a reason to call him out. She never used slurs. No, she was too careful for that. But her tone said everything her words didn't. She'd hover nearby as Malik mopped the hallway, arms crossed, tapping one foot like she was timing him. If he wiped down a glass partition, she'd run a finger along the edge and scoff, even when it was spotless. Once, she dumped a trash bin just after he'd emptied it and said flatly, "You missed something." One morning, Malik was polishing the floor in front of the West Conference Room when a group of executives walked past. They wore crisp suits and carried the kind of confidence that came from corner offices and six-figure bonuses. As they passed, one of them chuckled and said under his breath, "He's doing better than the last guy, at least this one shows up on time." The others laughed. Malik didn't look up. He just kept polishing. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe you were nothing. It made the truth hit that much harder when it finally arrived. But some moments cut deeper than others. On the fourth day, Malik was cleaning the executive break room when he heard Sandra's voice behind him. "What is that smell?" she barked. He turned to see her standing with her hands on her hips, nose wrinkled in exaggerated disgust. There was no smell. The room was clean, the counters were spotless, and the floor had just been mopped. Still, she walked in like she owned the place, sniffing the air. "Don't they teach hygiene wherever you're from?" she added. Malik met her eyes calmly. "I believe the room's clean, ma'am." Sandra stepped forward, close enough to invade his space. "Well, I don't," she snapped. "So do it again." And just like that, she turned and knocked over the trash can with her foot, sending coffee cups and crumpled napkins spilling across the tile. Malik bent down and began cleaning, each motion slow, deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He could feel the eyes of two junior employees standing by the fridge, frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen a thing. They did what most people do. They turned and walked away. That afternoon, Brian Carter made his appearance. Brian had been conspicuously absent during Malik's first few shifts, but on that particular day, he strutted into the janitorial supply room as if on cue. Malik was rinsing out a mop head when he heard the familiar voice behind him. Well, Brian drawled, arms folded. "Look who's still here. I figured you'd last maybe 2 days." Malik didn't reply. Brian stepped further into the room. "Gotta say, I'm impressed. Not because you're doing a good job. Just because you're still standing. Sandra's been on a roll lately." Malik wrung out the mop, hanging it on the hook. "I do what I'm asked." Brian gave a short laugh. "Yeah? We'll see how long that lasts." From that moment on, Brian made it his mission to make Malik's life harder. He would walk the halls and deliberately drop trash after Malik had just cleaned. He'd spill coffee in the elevator and page janitorial over the intercom with a tone thick with sarcasm. "We've had an accident, might need the expert." He called Malik boy whenever he could get away with it. And always, it was in front of someone. A junior associate. A receptionist. Another manager. Never when it was just the two of them. That way, it was harder to accuse. Harder to prove. But Malik didn't need to prove anything. Not yet. He watched. He memorized. Every insult. Every chuckle. Every bystander who said nothing. And though his face remained calm, his mind was building a map. A map of this company's soul. Who showed decency? Who showed cowardice? Who hid their prejudice behind polished shoes and LinkedIn profiles? Not everyone ignored him. One woman, a young administrative assistant named Rachel, offered him a bottle of water one morning when she saw him sweating after scrubbing the conference room carpet. She didn't say much. Just smiled, handed it to him, and walked away. It wasn't much. But it was everything. Because it reminded him that not all hearts were rotten. Still, the worst moment came 2 days later, in front of a dozen witnesses. Malik had just finished detailing the glass in the executive lounge, wiping down each table until they gleamed. The light from the windows refracted across the surfaces like crystal. He was proud of the work, even if no one would ever notice. Sandra noticed. She stormed in, heels clicking against the floor like hammers. "What is this?" she snapped, pointing at the table. Malik looked at it. "That's the conference table, ma'am." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "Are you being smart with me?" "No, ma'am. I just finished cleaning it." "Well, it's filthy," she hissed. Before he could respond, she grabbed a full cup of black coffee from the counter, walked to the center of the room, and, with zero hesitation, hurled it across the table. The dark liquid splashed, ran across the glass, and dripped onto the freshly waxed floor. Now, the room was silent. A few employees had been walking by. They stopped. A junior partner on the phone paused mid-sentence. One of the accountants dropped her pen. Sandra folded her arms. "Clean it again." Malik stared at the mess. Then he looked up at Sandra. And he smiled. Because at that moment, everything he needed to see was confirmed. This wasn't just about him. It was about the company. The culture. The sickness hiding behind high-rise walls and corporate branding. He picked up the rag and began to wipe. Behind him, someone whispered, "That's not right." But no one said anything else. Not yet. Malik finished cleaning, stood, and walked out of the room with the same calm steps he'd entered with. And somewhere, deep down, Sandra began to feel the first tremor of something she couldn't name. Because the way he looked at her, even as she tried to humiliate him, it wasn't the look of a man defeated. It was the look of a man waiting. And soon, they'd all find out what, exactly, he was waiting for. The morning after the coffee incident, Malik stood outside the building longer than usual. The sun hadn't yet risen above the Chicago skyline, but the marble facade of Thompson Holdings already glowed beneath the early light. He looked up at the windows, the floors he had cleaned, the offices where people barely glanced his way, the break rooms where smirks were more common than smiles, and took a breath that was deeper than he intended. This wasn't just a job anymore. It never had been. But now, the stakes were different. Because now, he'd seen enough. Inside, the building moved like clockwork. Security badges beeped. Elevators hummed. Phones rang behind frosted glass. Everything looked polished on the surface. But beneath that polish was a culture Malik could now feel pulsing in the walls. And it wasn't just Sandra and Brian anymore. It was in the jokes passed around at lunch. In the way people whispered when he walked by. It was in the casual dismissal. The invisible lines that separated them from people like him. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was collecting. Malik had begun to keep a notebook. Not in plain sight, of course. It stayed folded deep in his backpack, sandwiched between a maintenance manual and a pair of gloves. But every night, back in the small studio apartment he'd rented under a different name, he wrote it all down. Times. Names. Conversations. Patterns. He didn't need to embellish. The truth spoke loud enough on its own. The passive discrimination. The structural inequality. The small humiliations that built over days until they chipped at a man's dignity. He documented it all because he knew that when the time came, he wouldn't just confront it emotionally. He would confront it systemically. Sandra remained relentless. Her tactics grew bolder, more theatrical. One morning, Malik arrived to find that his cleaning cart had been mysteriously relocated to a different floor, far from his assigned station. When he tracked it down, supplies were missing. The mop was damaged. His keys had been swapped with non-functional duplicates. He said nothing. Just replaced what was broken and started his work. When he passed her in the hallway later that day, she smirked and said, "You're not going to last the week." Malik just nodded. "We'll see." Brian, on the other hand, seemed to relish his role as silent tormentor. He didn't shout like Sandra. He didn't need to. He simply made Malik's job harder at every turn. Elevators would be held up for no reason. Cleaning requests would pile up at the last minute. He once cornered Malik in the staff kitchen while no one else was around and leaned in with that same oily smile. "Funny thing about people like you," Brian said, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't know when you've overstayed your welcome. This company doesn't need social experiments. We need professionals. You're just filling space." Malik didn't move. He just looked at Brian with a steady gaze. Then he asked, "What would you do if I wasn't who you thought I was?" Brian chuckled. "I'd still tell you to stay in your lane." Malik walked past him, not looking back. Not all moments were bleak. Rachel, the quiet assistant from the accounting department, had begun to speak to him more often. Not in pity. Not in performance. Just genuine, human conversation. She would offer a warm good morning, ask how his day was going, and sometimes linger for a few minutes when she noticed the fatigue behind his eyes. "I don't get it," she said one afternoon as they stood by the break room window. "You work harder than anyone else I see, and you're the only one who gets yelled at every hour. Doesn't that wear on you?" Malik didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "I guess I've learned how to carry it." Rachel frowned. "Doesn't mean you should have to." That stuck with him. Not because it was profound, but because it was rare. By the end of the week, Malik had built a mental map of the office, who held power, who wielded it with cruelty, and who stood quietly on the sidelines. He noticed who laughed at Sandra's comments and who looked away. He tracked which employees sent cleaning requests through the system versus who left sticky notes with instructions like wipe better or do it right this time. The patterns weren't hard to see. Most of the worst behavior came from those in mid-level authority. The ones with just enough power to feel important but not enough to feel secure. The upper executives? Most of them hadn't noticed Malik at all. Which, to him, said just as much. That Friday evening, as the office began to empty out and the cleaners moved through the halls with their carts, Malik stepped outside onto the loading dock behind the building to catch his breath. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a private number. He knew who it was. He answered without speaking. A familiar voice came through. "Malik," his father said, "I'm flying in Monday morning." Malik closed his eyes. "I'm ready." William Thompson, the man who built the empire that bore his name, hadn't spoken publicly about his succession plans. Most assumed the company would pass to his younger son from his second marriage, or to the board president. But Malik had been his firstborn, raised apart from the spotlight, taught not to rely on his father's legacy but to forge his own path. He had. But this company still had his blood in its foundation. And now, he was ready to walk back through the front doors not as a cleaner, but as the future. "You've seen what you needed to see?" William asked on the other end. Malik looked out across the alleyway, at the dumpsters where he'd found racist graffiti etched into a delivery bin just 3 nights ago. He thought about the spilled coffee, the whispered jokes, the long hours and the longer silences. "I've seen more than I wanted," he replied. There was a pause. "I'll be there by 9, his father said. "Let's make it official." Malik hung up and sat down on the edge of the platform. For the first time in days, he let the fatigue sink in. His muscles ached. His hands were rough and calloused from scrubbing tile. His shoulders carried the residue of everything he'd absorbed in silence. But inside, he felt clearer than he ever had before. He knew now, without question, what kind of leader this company needed. Not someone who looked the part. Not someone who said the right things in public statements or donated to performative causes. It needed someone who had seen the cracks in the marble. Who had felt the heat of humiliation. Who understood that leadership wasn't about corner offices or quarterly growth, it was about culture. It was about how people were treated when they were at their lowest. It was about respect. And come Monday morning, everyone who had ignored him, laughed at him, dismissed him, or tried to break him, they were going to learn who Malik Thompson really was. Not because he would announce it loudly, but because when his father stepped off that elevator and introduced him as the next CEO, no one would be able to look away. They'd have no choice but to reckon with what they had done. And for the first time in a long time, Malik allowed himself to smile. Because the story was about to change. And this time, he would be the one writing it. Monday morning arrived with a kind of quiet intensity that only a few could feel. To most employees at Thompson Holdings, it was just another beginning to another week. Another string of meetings, deadlines, coffee runs, and status updates. But beneath the calm exterior of the glass skyscraper, something was shifting. There was a buzz in the air, low, electrical, uncertain. Something was coming. They just didn't know what. Malik stood once again in the janitor's locker room, tying the last knot on his uniform shirt. It looked no different than it had on the first day he'd worn it. Still wrinkled around the collar. Still slightly faded around the seams. The same mop waited outside the door. The same rubber gloves tucked in his back pocket. But Malik was no longer the same man. Something in his presence had changed, grown firmer, more resolved, like a mountain that had silently withstood the storms and was now ready to rise. At 8:57 a.m., the lobby was bustling. Executives filed in, briefcases in hand, laughing and chatting in tight groups. The receptionist was on the phone, her voice light and professional, while her fingers tapped nervously at the keyboard. She glanced at the elevator several times. Brian Carter had arrived early, wearing his sharpest suit and his broadest grin. He paced slowly near the main entrance, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He knew William Thompson was coming in today, and he intended to make the most of it. This, in his mind, was the moment he'd been waiting for. Impress the boss, plant a seed, maybe even get a promotion. He'd prepared a list of achievements, memorized a few flattering remarks, and told himself that today would be the day he'd finally get noticed by the man at the top. Sandra was nearby too. She had traded her usual scowl for something she thought resembled poise. She had on a new blouse, sprayed on just a bit more perfume than usual, and rehearsed her greeting under her breath. She'd been at Thompson Holdings for over 20 years, and if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was adjust her mask depending on who walked into the room. When it came to the boss, she would play friendly, respectful, even warm, if it meant securing her place. They didn't notice Malik. He stood off to the side, mop in hand, badge clipped to his pocket, looking like a shadow in their world. They had walked past him 100 times by now. And today, they did the same. Not a glance. Not a nod. He didn't expect one. Then the elevator dinged. And silence followed. Every conversation in the lobby stopped as the silver doors slid open, revealing William Thompson himself. He stepped out slowly, dressed in a gray tailored suit, crisp white shirt, and no tie, his signature style. His hair was neatly parted, his posture straight, his eyes focused and piercing. He didn't rush. He never did. Behind him were two senior executives, one assistant, and a man holding a leather portfolio. But it was William everyone watched. The room stood a little straighter. Brian took a step forward, hand ready to shake, words of greeting already on his tongue. But William didn't stop for him. He walked past Brian without a glance. Past Sandra. Past the receptionist. His eyes were searching for someone else. And then they landed on Malik. For a moment, no one else moved. The man in the janitor uniform. Still holding the mop. Still standing where they had left him. William Thompson smiled. And then, to the shock of every single person in the lobby, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, today is a very important day." Heads turned. William stepped into the center of the room and continued, "As many of you know, I've spent the last 30 years building this company from the ground up. I've made mistakes. I've made progress. And now, I'm ready to begin the most important chapter of all, transition." Brian looked confused. Sandra's smile faltered. "I'm proud," William said, his voice growing stronger, "to introduce you all to someone very important. The next CEO of Thompson Holdings. My firstborn son. Malik, would you come here?" It was like someone had pulled the oxygen out of the room. Every head turned. Every breath caught. The room, just seconds ago buzzing with ambition, now stood frozen in disbelief. And Malik stepped forward. Still in uniform. Still wearing the same shoes they had mocked. The same badge they had ignored. But now, he moved with quiet authority. With presence. With the weight of truth behind his every step. Brian's smile shattered. Sandra's mouth parted in a stunned gasp. Whispers broke through the stillness like cracks in ice. "Wait, him? Is this real? No way. He's the janitor." Malik stood beside his father, then turned to face the lobby full of people who had spent the last week judging him without ever knowing who he was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was listening now. "I know you have questions," he said slowly, his voice measured, composed. "I would too. But let me say this first. For the last 7 days, I've worked here undercover. I cleaned your floors. Emptied your trash. Polished your tables. I watched. I listened. And I saw things I can't ignore." His eyes moved from one face to the next. Some turned away. Some looked down. A few, like Rachel, met his gaze with quiet understanding. Malik continued, I saw how people are treated when they don't look the part. I saw how power is used not to protect, but to humiliate. I saw what happens when respect is earned by appearance instead of character. Then, his gaze landed on Brian. You mocked me. Laughed in my face. Dropped trash in my path and told others I didn't belong. Brian opened his mouth, tried to form words. Sir, I didn't know. Malik raised a hand. Brian's voice died. Then Malik turned to Sandra. You threw coffee across the table and made me clean it in front of others. Not because it was dirty, but because you could. Sandra's face had lost all color. I didn't mean, I thought. You thought I was beneath you, Malik said softly. Because to you, I was just a janitor. Then he let the silence stretch, long and deliberate, until the weight of it settled on every shoulder in the room. And finally, William spoke again. Now you all know who Malik is. And you know what this moment means. But it's not just about one person. It's about this company. What it has become. What it must never be again. He turned to Malik. Son, the floor is yours. Malik stepped forward, mop still in hand. And with a calm breath, he said, change begins now. The lobby, once filled with pride and polish, was now filled with something else. Truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't go back into hiding. For a long moment, no one moved. The room, just minutes ago filled with chatter, with confident steps and hurried greetings, now stood like a photograph frozen in time. The mop in Malik's hand was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol. A memory. A challenge. He held it loosely, but deliberately, as if daring every soul in that room to remember exactly how they had treated the man now standing in front of them. William Thompson remained at his side, saying nothing, his arms crossed over his chest, allowing his son to lead. His eyes scanned the crowd, not with judgment, but with expectation. And that alone made the silence even heavier. Then Malik spoke again. His voice didn't rise, but it filled the space with ease. This past week, I've watched. I've listened. I've learned. And what I saw disappointed me. I walked these halls, I cleaned your offices, I wiped up your spills. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see how this company, my company, treats those without power, those without titles. He paused, letting the words sink deep. I didn't like what I saw. The ripple in the room was subtle but unmistakable. Feet shifted. Hands were clasped tighter. The echo of guilt began to settle in the spaces between people. Malik turned slowly, allowing his gaze to fall on each face, some embarrassed, some ashamed, and a few simply afraid. Brian Carter stood stiff, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the elevators as if escape were an option. Sandra Miller looked like the floor beneath her had disappeared. Her knuckles were white where they clutched her planner. Let's be clear, Malik continued. This isn't about me being treated unfairly as your janitor. This is about a culture. One where belittling others is tolerated. Where kindness is considered weakness. Where people like Brian, he turned now, his voice narrowing, mock others to protect their own pride. And people like Sandra, his eyes found hers, abuse authority to hide their insecurity. Brian opened his mouth again, perhaps to justify, perhaps to beg. But Malik didn't give him the chance. He turned to his father. Dad. William stepped forward, his voice low but firm. What do you think should happen? Malik didn't hesitate. They can't stay. William nodded once, slowly. Brian Carter, he said, turning with solemn gravity. Your employment at Thompson Holdings is terminated immediately. Brian's shoulders dropped as if someone had cut the strings holding him up. His lips parted, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, sir, but there was nothing else. Just silence. Just the awful truth of a man who had finally run out of lies to hide behind. William didn't even look at him again. He turned to Sandra. Sandra Miller, he said, your role as janitorial supervisor is revoked effective immediately. You are no longer employed by this company." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. But she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because, deep down, she knew there was no defense for what she had done. Justice wasn't loud that morning. It was quiet, precise, and complete. But Malik wasn't finished. He looked out again at the employees gathered, some who had laughed, others who had stood by, and the rare few who had dared to offer kindness. And then his eyes found her, Rachel. She stood near the back of the crowd, her expression unreadable, but her posture strong. She hadn't asked for anything. She had never tried to ingratiate herself. She had simply seen him as a human being. Nothing more. Nothing less. "My first act as CEO," Malik said, "is to promote Rachel Jacobs to Senior Administrative Coordinator, effective immediately." A gasp moved through the crowd like a soft wind. Rachel's hand went to her mouth. She took a step forward but stopped short, stunned. "I saw how you treated people," Malik said, addressing her now. "Not just me, but everyone. You led with respect. You didn't have to be loud to be strong. This company needs more people like you." Applause didn't come immediately. Not because people disagreed, but because they were stunned into something else, recognition. Of a new kind of leadership. A new kind of power. The kind that doesn't bark orders. The kind that doesn't demand obedience. The kind that earns trust simply by standing in truth. Malik let the moment sit. Then, softly, he began again. "I want you all to understand something," he said. "I didn't come here looking for revenge. I didn't do this to embarrass anyone. I did this because something in this company needed to be exposed. Not to punish, but to rebuild." He took a slow breath. This company cannot succeed if it allows prejudice to grow behind closed doors. It cannot grow if we don't value every single person, from the boardroom to the janitor's closet. Respect cannot be conditional. It cannot be reserved only for the well-dressed, the well-spoken, or the well-connected. It has to live here. He placed his hand over his chest. Every day. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. Then another. And another. Soon, the lobby echoed not with judgment, but with something else. Something cleansing. Applause. It wasn't thunderous. It was steady. Real. William Thompson stepped forward again and looked at his son. There was pride in his eyes, but also humility. He extended his hand. Malik took it. And in that simple gesture, one generation passed the torch to the next. Not with fanfare, but with faith. Later that day, Malik changed out of his janitor's uniform and into a suit, not designer, not flashy, just clean, pressed, and quiet. He walked the halls of Thompson Holdings with a new badge clipped to his chest. It read, Malik Thompson, Chief Executive Officer. People passed him and nodded now. Some smiled. A few stopped to apologize. He accepted each moment with grace, but he never forgot the week that led him here. He didn't want to forget. Because remembering kept him grounded. Remembering reminded him that dignity, once stripped, must be fought for and defended. By week's end, a new company-wide policy had been drafted and approved. One focused on equity, accountability, and zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Training programs were scheduled. Anonymous reporting lines were installed. Department heads were briefed that evaluations would now include how they treated employees at every level, not just those above them. And Malik? He made a habit of showing up unannounced. Not to catch people, but to remind them that leadership wasn't something you wore. It was something you lived. In quiet moments. In small decisions. And in how you treat the person who mops your floors when you think no one else is watching. By the time Friday came, the culture at Thompson Holdings hadn't completely changed. But it had started to shift. And sometimes, that's enough. Not to finish the journey, but to begin it. Malik stood by the window of his new office that evening, the skyline stretching out before him like a promise. The city moved below, unaware of what had taken place within these walls. But he knew. And the people who mattered knew too. He didn't come from legacy suits or corporate grooming. He came from resilience. From truth. From a mother who taught him that integrity was not a weapon, it was a compass. And now, as the light faded from the sky, he whispered something he hadn't said in years. We build better this time. And this time, no one could stop him. End of part 5, approximate 1,415 words. If you'd like a full script formatted for voiceover narration or YouTube adaptation, with pacing, shot suggestions, or audio cues, I can help you finalize that next. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. 4.0. You said. Them outro veo. ChatGPT said. Certainly. Below is the outro written in the same slow, emotionally resonant, and cinematic tone as the rest of the story. It transitions naturally from Malik's final moment and speaks directly to the viewer in a reflective and powerful way, just like an ending from a Black Struggles or Hope Core video would. And maybe that's the story we all needed to hear. Not just about power, or revenge, or even justice, but about choice. Malik Thompson could have revealed himself on the first day. He could have demanded respect with his last name. But he didn't. Because he understood something most people never learn. That real change doesn't happen when you force people to treat you differently. It happens when they realize they should have, all along. And when they do, that moment, that silence when the truth finally lands, is louder than any speech, any punishment, or any promotion ever could be. So maybe the question isn't what would you do if you had the power? Maybe the real question is, what are you doing when you think no one's watching? Because someone always is. And the way you treat people, the way you speak to them, look at them, value them, that's the legacy you leave behind. Malik didn't build his legacy on control or ego. He built it on something much harder to earn. Respect. And now, his company isn't just under new leadership. It's under new values. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity belongs to everyone, not just those in suits or behind desks, then take a moment. Share it. Reflect on it. And remember, the ones we overlook today might be the ones leading us tomorrow. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. And maybe the real story wasn't just about revenge. It was about respect. About what happens when you judge someone too quickly and realize too late who they really are. Because the truth is, the people we ignore today might be the ones leading us tomorrow. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Disrespected Stories. We tell powerful stories that reveal the truth behind everyday injustice and the strength it takes to rise above it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.